Thanks, Marlena, for that introduction. Just want to thank all of you for being here. What I'd like to do is, I was asked to kind of give an overview of what the city and county is involved in as it relates to construction. How many of you, I guess, real quickly, by a rough set of hands, how many of you guys are contractors? Okay. How many of you guys are engineers, consultants, design consultants? Okay. And then how many of you are from, maybe from a government agency or some other entity like that? Okay. All right, so seems like we got a good mix, which is good. I think this one, I tried to make it somewhat applicable. It's kind of broad, so just give me a little bit of leeway because it will probably be very broad, and I'm going to probably go through this real quickly. Some of the information that I put together, as I was kind of putting all this presentation together, I noticed that as I was putting it together, actually I started realizing the substantial changes that we've undergone as a city agency. And this all goes back to when I first started with the city back in 20 years ago, back in 1996, around that time. And from what it was then to what it is now, there has been quite a bit of changes. And so, just to give you a little background, why do we do all of this? Again, there's all kinds of different ways of, there's all kinds of sources where pollution comes from. You're talking about oil and greases, from cars, vehicles, things like that. Trash and debris that you always see from whether it's organic or it's man-made. And then you have your soil erosion, that's whether in the stream itself or caused by human activities such as construction. And well, the reason why our program is in place, and this is all under this large Clean Water Act, a federal program that gets handed down to all the states. And what the city and county is basically a regulated entity. So it is really the city who has to come into the state to apply for a permit. And that's what it allows us to do is to discharge water from the city's drain system into receiving waters like your streams, canals, and waterways. And you can see some of the effects of this water pollution, what it has on the receiving waters, such as sediment runoff. You can see a lot of the debris, the floatables, and then of course you can see a lot of that discoloration. So what are some of the immediate goals that the city is trying to accomplish through its permit program? Well, one of course is we're trying to comply with our MS4 requirements. The second thing is we're trying to always streamline our processes because it is we do have quite a bit of large impact from a city standpoint because we affect pretty much all the residential urban areas throughout the island of Oahu. We're also trying to be able to come up with some kind of consistent approach. So because there's regulations in place at the federal level as well as at the state level, what we're trying to do is be able to at least come up with something that's consistent with that's existing programs so that we're not kind of overlapping or duplicating, but also we're not making something that is going to go against what the current regulations are. We also try to streamline and standardize the process, and that's one of our goals we've been trying to do within the city itself because there's, like Marlena had mentioned, one of the things that we're tasked with doing as a city agency as part of our Department of Facility Maintenance is we need to coordinate with all the city departments. And the stormwater program, the way we kind of approach it is it's basically one water. It's not only one department, it's not only one department or section's responsibility, but it's pretty much the whole entire city that's responsible. So we have to coordinate with things like fire department, police department, parks and recreation, enterprise services. We also have to work with the agencies that implement a lot of these programs that pertain to construction, like our Department of Planning and Permitting and our Department of Design and Construction. And more recently, you can see that for the rail project for HART, so we have to do a lot of this coordination and making sure that everybody is following what the guidelines are. Okay, and then lastly, for of course the long term, this is ultimately, I think, everybody that's here. I think you took the first step to actually attend this workshop, which is actually a very good part on your part, is to really, what we're trying to do is promote a sustainable future. And what we're looking at is protecting our nearshore waters, like our beaches, our streams, our ocean, where we also, here in Hawaii, we're basically on an island, so we're basically surrounded by water. So whatever impacts that we create is going to impact the future for the generations to come. So I think that's probably ultimately, that's one of the long-term goals that we're always trying to establish. Okay, so now when we talk about how it affects construction, primarily how it's handled is in the city, it's within the Department of Planning and Permitting. And they have, within their department, they have rules, which is referred to as their rules relating to soil erosion standards that were adopted in 1999. And then we have also the rules relating to storm drainage standards that were adopted in June 2012. You could see that erosion standards are more for what we talk about more temporary things, things that while you're in construction, there's always things going on that you're going to have to follow these certain practices and best management implementation of BMPs. For the drainage standards, it's more looking at long-term permanent things that, once it's actually built, it's going to be there for the next 10, 20, 50 years and so forth. So that's where, the way that the city implements its programs. How this all kind of, when we talk about some of the overview and the changes that I'm going to be sharing, some of the things that kind of started this whole movement was, I guess, we go back to this back in 2013. EPA, under their Region 9 office, they had performed an audit of the city's program. And what they do is they have their inspectors or their auditors that come down and they look at the city's overall program. And it's a pretty big deal where all the city departments are asked to come in and they're evaluating how the city is following its permit and how it's implementing its program. And then from that evaluation or that audit, what they found was that there were several permit violations as well as program deficiencies. Primarily as it relates to construction, what they saw was that the city's construction plan review and BMP requirements were inadequate. When they looked at all our documentation, I mentioned earlier the rules that we had in place, that they felt it was inadequate. The other thing was that for any inspection oversight, that the cities, for both public and private projects, that the city wasn't performing its necessary inspections in accordance to its program plans. And then lastly, we also had something where they recommended that the city should implement some type of a dedicated stormwater inspections, looking at the BMPs to make sure that the contractors were following the plans that they had put in place. And then from there would be developing some kind of a risk ranking process to be able to evaluate its effectiveness. So based on all of that, that audit that was performed, what followed was a notice of apparent violation that was issued to the city back in October of 2013. Now, fast forward a couple years later, that's where the city's permit, it's on a 5-year permit cycle, and it basically expired in 2014, I believe. What happened was that the Department of Health proceeded with drafting the city's new permit that became effective on February 16, 2015, and is scheduled to expire on January 15, 2020. And based on that audit report, they took a lot of those recommendations, those deficiencies, and they basically wrote it into the city's permit and said that you shall do these things in order to comply with your requirements. How the city manages that is through its stormwater management program plan. And in that plan itself, there's 7 elements that you can see here as it pertains to either public outreach, it does for pollution prevention. This is like a lot of our housekeeping practices where we do street sweeping, drain cleaning, things like that. Post-construction, so I mentioned anything that happens after the construction is done. Industrial, commercial, illicit discharge, monitoring. But the one that I'm going to be focusing on for this presentation is the construction site runoff program. Okay, so as I mentioned, the city's permit was reissued in 2015, and in that permit, basically what it said was that within 18 months, the city shall update its rules as it relates to both construction and post-construction. And what that essentially did was put a deadline of August 16, 2016, which the city needed to go back, look at its existing rules, and then update it so that it would be in compliance with those requirements. As I mentioned earlier, we had 2 separate rules. One was pertaining to drainage, the other one pertaining to construction, erosion. What we essentially did was we combined them into one. This made it a lot easier just from a standpoint of thinking about it from a clean water environmental standpoint, that it was all under one, that you wouldn't have to refer to one versus the other. And it also put everything all in one line so that we could always compare to see if there was any discrepancies. So that's where it led to this, what is we're now referring to as the rules relating to water quality. So some of the timeline that I'll go through, again, back in 2015, that's when the city's permit had become effective. In March 6th of 2015, the Senate had introduced this resolution which went through, and it basically asked all the county agencies to go back and look at their rules and see if there needed to be increased or made it more stringent. So, of course, that was something already on our mind because of the permit, but this was just another thing that came across our came across our desk. In 2016, we proceeded with, of course, going back, looking at our rules, and making any kind of changes that it would, in order to make it more stringent. In July 5th of 2016, we had a public, we posted our notice to introduce the draft rules. And in August 4th, 2016, we had a public hearing, inviting the public to come down to solicit any comments as far as the changes that we were proposing. And then on August 14th, the rules were finalized. And then on August 10th, the mayor had signed the rules. So at this point in time, it actually just recently had gotten adopted. One thing that we did prescribe in those rules, though, was we didn't want to make it effective until 1 year later. So, which is why I have that last one here, which is in August 16, 2017, when the rules actually become effective. And the reason is because we made such substantial changes to those rules that we felt that we needed to go back, talk to all of the city agencies, get the contractors as well to do a lot of outreach, and we'll be able to start implementing some of these changes within our programs, because it's going to definitely change the way that how they do their reviews, how they track the information, how they process all these new plans and submittals that pertain to the city. Within those rules, as I mentioned, there are certain key definitions that I just wanted to point out. Some of the things that we just want to emphasize is that we talk about what is considered a regulated project versus a non-regulated project. A regulated project is project that has to come into the city for a grading, building, stockpiling, grubbing, trenching permit. Any of those permits would already automatically trigger having to fall under these rules. If it didn't trigger any of those rules, then of course the city wouldn't have any kind of jurisdiction over that. And then of course there are some specific type of exemptions that we had built into the rules, which is things like emergency work and putting out traffic control devices, signs, things like that, striping, which is not necessarily where you're actually, our focus is really targeting projects where there's ground disturbing activity. So whenever you penetrate the ground, you're actually disturbing it, moving the soil around, that's where we want to target. This is where the rules become effective. The other thing that I wanted to point out, a key definition, is the erosion and sediment control plans. Now this is something that the city implements as far as how they comply with its requirements. And it's a key part of how the inspectors follow what the contractor is doing. And basically what we're talking about is the actual drawing that shows the limits of your project, where all your critical points are, where your discharge points, where your catch basins, inlets, things like that, where you're going to be disturbing in your activity, how you're going to be phasing your work. And it's something that, as a contractor, you guys use while you're doing your work, but also from a city's point, they're using it as part of their inspection process. So that's something that we are going to be making changes in terms of what needs to go into these sediment control plans. And this is something that's somewhat separate from what the state requires, because under their NPDES program, the State Department of Health requires that you develop what is referred to as a stormwater pollution prevention plan. So it's a SWIP plan, but that's more like a written document that actually describes how you're gonna go about doing your work, how you schedule it, things like that, and identifying what those critical pollutants that are of concern. So it's a similar process, but of course this is something that streamlines the process for a city inspector of what they're looking for is on an actual drawing. And so they can actually pinpoint what the location of where these BMPs are going to be installed, how you're going to go about doing it. Other key definitions I wanted to point out is something that we've added into the rules, which is a certified stormwater plan preparer. It's still something that's in development. It's not something that the city has really put in place, but it gives us, the city, an opportunity to try to come up with a process of how we can kind of make something more standardized or more to be able to get someone who's actually preparing the plans to be more trained and qualified in putting those erosion and sediment control plans. We don't have it in place right now, but it is something that's described in the rules. The other thing, of course, that the city has always had in place, which is a design engineer. And this is sort of a licensed civil engineer in the state of Hawaii who can actually stamp the drawings. And these pertains to larger projects where it does require, under the city's ordinances, that somebody who has those qualifications needs to submit those plans in order to get that approved by the city. And then the last one is erosion sediment control, or ESCP coordinator. And this is somebody that's actually doesn't have necessarily any type of specific training, but it is the designated person that's going to be providing the inspections of your construction site. So that's the designated person that's going to be whether making any changes, minor changes to the plans itself, or actually doing the inspections themselves, this is like the representative of whether the owner of the project. This can be also the owner himself, so these are for more smaller type projects what we're talking about, but it's basically a designated person who's going to be responsible. So when we talk about construction, we're talking about how we go about doing the plan review, inspections. Some of the key points that I wanted to emphasize, in terms of how we look at it from a city standpoint of how do we try to encourage contractors, developers, how they can comply with their requirements is, of course, one is putting together an adequate and effective erosion and sediment control plan, or also in the case of the State Department of Health's case, this would be a stormwater pollution prevention plan, or SWIP. The other thing is that you're always emphasizing what is the training that you're providing to your contractors, your subcontractors, how is the communication process, because we see a lot of times when we're meeting with contractors, it's like they're assuming that somebody's going to take care of it, but because of that communication gap, there's no actual one person that's responsible, or either that or everybody's kind of pointing the finger at somebody else. So I think that's really key, where you're actually continuously communicating, you're providing some kind of training for your subcontractors as well as your contractors, the people that are on site. And of course, you have your inspections that we're asking the contractor to perform, as well as the documentation. So those are all important to have on your site, and because that's going to provide the inspector who comes to visit to see how you're staying on top of the BMP implementation as well as your maintenance. And that leads into the last one, which is, of course, how you perform the maintenance as well as the corrective actions. The way we look at it, and we always emphasize to contractors, is this is a dynamic process. We know that projects are always going on at the same time, so it's something that needs to be changed, because we know site conditions change. We know that things are going to be happening where it may not work in this situation, so there needs to be a change at that time. So that's where the documentation as well as the communication does become an important part of that process. So now when we talk about the current rules that I mentioned that we adopted, so some of those major changes we talked about was updating it to be consistent with the state and federal laws. So that was one of the key goals that we needed to do. And then the other part of it, like I mentioned earlier, was that we had that audit performed, in which case what was pointed out to the city was that we needed to emphasize more of the smaller projects, as well as those projects that are in the vertical stage. So we're talking about high-rise projects, condominiums, things that are in the more vertical stage, like your house building, things like that. And then, of course, putting in more stringent inspection and enforcement requirements. So this is the current reason how the city approaches it. This is what we call our category system, and it's basically looking at it from a size standpoint of how big your project is. So if you're in the category 1, we're talking about very small projects. These are like your building permitted sites. And then as you go along within category 2 to 5, you're talking about more your grading, grubbing type of permits. As you work your way down to category 5, that's the largest projects, where it's over 1 acre in size. And that would automatically trigger having to get also a NPDES permit. What we did implement as part of this process, this rulemaking process, was we also created these subcategories within that smaller category 1 projects. So what we're calling is your category 1A, 1B, and 1C. And the pretty easiest way to look at it is 1A would be your small, 1B would be your medium, and 1C would be your large. So 1C is like your 1 acre and larger. 1B would be anything over 1,000 square feet or larger, as well as the commercial development. And then 1A is all your small residential type. So these are where people are putting in a retaining wall, or putting in fencing, or putting in maybe an addition to their existing home or something. So it's something that's less than 1,000 square feet. The challenge that the city has is, you can see here just a breakdown. When you look at all the permits that the city issues, we have roughly on a fiscal year basis, we looked at it in 2014, the city issues roughly, just on the building permit side, over 30,000 permits a year. When we're talking about, this is only the ones that, what I show here in this pie chart is just the ones that are focused on what we think would be considered your regulated projects. We're not sure we don't know for sure, but as we kind of implement this program, we'll start to find out. But you can see on the right-hand side that all the different type of permits that triggers where you have either an addition, a new building, a pool, a fence. These are all projects that would trigger a building permit. And you can see that when we looked at all of those type of projects, it comes out to maybe about roughly 7,000 projects. So we kind of looked at this big set of projects, got it down to a smaller set where we feel that this is where the focus should be because that's where they're doing any type of ground disturbance activities. And then from there, that's going to be what we're trying to target. But you can also see that the majority of the projects, maybe about 80% of them, are in that new building, additions, fencing categories. The rest are real small, less than 10%, which is like your retaining walls, your foundation, demolition type of projects. Okay, so with the water quality rules I mentioned, there are 3 requirements, and this is for any project that you talk about, and this is also both at the federal and state level. We're talking about erosion prevention, sediment control, and good housekeeping. Erosion prevention is basically where you're talking about preventing the water from displacing that soil. Once the water hits it, then it's going to start to travel to actually move that particle of soil. So what we're trying to do is prevent that from happening in the first place. So things that you could do is, of course, like vegetation, riprap, you can put in mulch, erosion control blankets are some of the other options. But also you can also do things like diversions, where you're actually trying to get the water away from your project site. So that's not actually flowing through the sloped areas, things like that. When you look at that rules, you can see how do we categorize them. You know, there are certain things that's described in the rules itself, but you can see from starting from the category 1, working your way down to the right, you see all the way up to category 5. Category 5, basically, we're saying that the minimum requirements, you have to address each one of these items. So all the projects, whether it's a small or large, of course, what we're saying is the minimum requirements is you're having to put together a schedule, having to provide some kind of permanent stabilization once the project is done, providing slope protection, and then, of course, temporary stabilization. So that's for all projects. But for larger projects, that's when we start talking about diversion structures, putting in things like for preserving some of the existing vegetation, because this is for large projects we're talking about. Sediment control, BMPs, these are things like where water has already traveled over it, it's actually carrying it now. So now the water is actually carrying all this sediment along with it. And of course, this is not the most preferred method, but this is also the most costly and time-consuming, because now you're actually trying to remove the sediment from the water itself. So these are things like where you're talking about check dams, silt fences, detention basins, sediment basins, things like that, where you're actually trying to remove the sediment. So when we look at the rules itself, again, looking at it from a category 1 to 5 standpoint, all projects would require some type of inlet protection, whether it's a small or large. And then, of course, you would have your perimeter controls like your silt fences or biosocks and things like that. But for larger projects, we're talking about things like sediment basins, sediment traps, you know, things where it's actually you need the space to be able to treat that amount of water. And then lastly, we have your good housekeeping BMPs. And this is, I think, the most important that we would like to emphasize, because this is the most cost-effective. This is the best way you can actually prevent any of that discharge of any kind of pollution from your site. So we talk about some of your day-to-day activities, like your fueling, your chemical storage, your where you're storing your equipment, your stockpiles, things like that. So these are all the recommendations of what you would need to do, what we would ask. And you can see the reason why we emphasize good housekeeping is, one, it's cost-effective, but also because it addresses a lot more of the pollutants besides just sediment. You know, when we talk about like nutrients, metals, oil and greases, pesticides, this is where good housekeeping does become much more effective. And you can see when we look at all the categories for category 1 to 5, what we're saying is good housekeeping pretty much applies to all projects. So whether it's a small project or a large project, you would need to take that into consideration. So some ways that the city provides is we have what is referred to as just similar to like the Department of Transportation highway system. We also have what is referred to as our construction BMP manual, and it provides guidance, it provides recommendations, it actually gives you fact sheets that you can use as part of your SWIP plan to insert, to say that these are the practices that we'll be following, whether it's a silt fence, and it provides some diagrams and things, so it's a useful document. When we talk about the erosion sediment control plans now, this is where, as you're putting all this documentation together, again, we had to kind of look at it from a standpoint of small projects versus large projects. Large projects, I think we always had that in place, but small project, this is a total different effort now. Something that we had to come in, where we're actually in development for now. And we had to come up with this, what we're providing is sort of like a checklist in a way. is to guide the homeowner or contractor, whoever it is that's working on this small project, to say, go through these processes, which BMPs you think is the most effective. You would say which is going to be the ones that are applied to your site, and then from there you would submit that to the city for approval. For large projects, of course, I think most of you guys are all aware of is this, when we talk about large projects where we're talking about where you actually have a site plan that's designed by an engineer. So this is where you actually have a layout, where you actually have diagrams and details, things like that. And some of the key things that the city expects, like from a Department of Planning and Permitting standpoint, is just identifying what are those BMPs that you're going to be applying on your site, as well as showing the actual layout of where the things are going to be located. Other things are like your details of showing how it's going to be installed. So this helps the inspector, of course, just to verify that things are being followed according to the plans. And of course, you're going to have your notes that describe whether it's the sequence of events, how you're going to go about doing your scheduling, as well as any kind of descriptions of what the requirements for the contractor to follow in terms of maintenance or inspections. Okay, so what I wanted to show on this one is you can see that, of course, the site plan was prepared initially, but what we expect from a city inspector is that this is always a dynamic process. So it's always going through these revisions. So you can see all the red lines where they're actually maybe be moving this basin here to another location, or they're going to be implementing additional BMPs because the ones that they're currently working on hasn't been effective. So they're going to add on more BMPs. So that's what this plan is expected to kind of show, this process of actually redlining and moving it and adjusting it according to your site conditions. And then just lastly, I know this doesn't come out very well, but this is also something that, from an inspector standpoint, is what we need to differentiate is between what is temporary versus what is permanent. So this is what we call more like a post-construction BMP plan. So what are some things that's going to be left on the project site after it's built? So if you're going to be putting in a sediment basin, is it only temporary, or is it going to be there at the end of the construction contract? So at that point in time, what they will refer to is that if it's shown, whatever is shown on this post-construction BMP plan, they're expecting at the final walkthrough and the final inspection that all these things are going to be still there in place after the project has been completed. I mentioned that there's three things that the city looks at. One is, of course, the sediment control plan. The other part is, of course, your inspections. The way that the city does it is there's three layers of the inspections that are implemented. One you can see from the self-inspections, which is the owner or contractor that performs throughout the duration of their project. And then you also have the city inspectors. So this is where, whether it's on a private project, the Department of Planning and Permitting will be coming out on a regular basis to inspect your project. But if it's also a city project, then that's where the Department of Design and Construction, DFM, ENV, whoever is responsible for that project will have an inspector that comes out to check to make sure, just verifying that the contractor is following their inspections, their documentation, their BMPs. And then lastly, we have what is referred to as our third-party inspections. And this is something that just started with this new permit. And I mentioned back in that 2013 audit is what the state as well as the EPA auditor wanted to do was to make the city implement this third-party inspection, which was somewhat like an independent, somebody that's not associated with the project itself, to come in to look at it to see how they're performing, how they're following their BMP plans, and then of course to look at how effective it was. So that's something that we just started this year. If you're a contractor, you probably might have started to notice some of our third-party inspectors coming out to your sites, basically looking at some of your BMPs and seeing how they're following it. From a self-inspection standpoint, our rules are basically saying that for pretty much all projects, they need to be inspected on a regular basis, but we kind of came up with this risk ranking process that for larger projects, of course, it would need to be done more frequently. So to be consistent with the state's requirements, we're saying that for any projects that are 1 acre or larger, you would need to do weekly inspections, which is the same requirement that you would have to do at the state level. For somewhat smaller projects, we felt that for category 3, 4, and also trenching projects, that also would require weekly inspections because of the critical nature of when you're doing a lot of the trenching. Any type of trenching permit that you need to get from the city is already telling us that you're doing work in the city right away. So if you're going to be digging up a trench in the roadway, there's a good chance that if there's any rainfall or if there's any runoff from your project site, then likely it's going to go into our storm drain. So that's why we felt that it needed to be done more frequently. But of course, for smaller projects like your Category 1 projects, those are where we're talking about doing it more on a monthly basis. So not as frequently, but obviously still needs to be done. Some of the, in the rules itself, we're actually prescribing, recommendations on the type of inspection checklist that we've developed. So you can see here, we kind of came up with something that is kind of similar to actually the Department of Transportation Highways inspection checklist. But what it basically does is has, of course, your general project information. And then, of course, it just, the type of inspection you're doing, whether it's a pre-construction inspection, or it's a during construction, or it's an inspection during a rainfall event that you would perform these. So you would need to check out which one you're doing. And of course, you would do, as you go through the inspection checklist, then you would need to describe what the activities that you're involved in, what is your project going to be doing, what are some of the documentation that you should be having on your site. This is in compliance with the state's requirements for their NPDES, so that you would need to have your monthly compliance reports, any of your documentation for your weekly inspections, things like that. And of course, your BMPs that you're inspecting. And then the next page would be, of course, where you're actually looking at all the different type of BMPs. You would check out which applies and how are they performing, whether you would note that if there's any deficiencies, and then from there would need to be some kind of corrective actions. And that would be kind of where, of course, each inspection report would need to be signed by that designated representative. And then this is where we would attach like some kind of a corrective action log. So you would note the photos, describe what the deficiency was, and what are the corrective actions that you took. Okay. From a city inspection standpoint, I just mentioned, so in addition to the contractor inspections, the city will be periodically coming out as well. And those schedules are, you can see here noted, but it's not as frequently, but still going at least to check to see how the contractor is performing. And then lastly, we have our third-party inspections, which we're trying to come up with this risk ranking process, just because the fact that the city has so many projects out there that it's likely that we're going to have to target which ones are the most critical projects that we need to inspect. And then from there, we're going to be coming out on a monthly basis. So you can see when we do our third-party inspections, this is just a snapshot of how we track and capture a lot of that information. We use this program where it's a web-based program where they go out to do their inspections, and then what they're doing is they're using their iPads or whatever documentation to fill out their inspection reports, and then that goes into the system where we actually start tracking all the deficiencies. So this is where we can start seeing how often, how many deficiencies, where are the deficiencies occurring, and this kind of helps us with our program effectiveness, where we can start looking at, we can actually even see which contractors are performing, where we can start seeing how many deficiencies are being issued to each project. We can actually look at a specific project as well as the type of contractors who's performing, and we can see if there might be some way that maybe we need to do some outreach, or maybe we need to do more training for a certain type of contractors because we're seeing a lot of deficiencies at those sites. The same thing here, we can actually look at some of the data where we can actually see at what stage of the project, where it's in the early grading, grubbing stage, or maybe it's later on when we can actually see what the type of deficiencies are. Is it more the inlet protection devices? Is it more the documentation? Is it more of the maintaining of the sediment basins? This is just ways of how we can look at it from a program effectiveness standpoint. The way that we kind of categorize the inspections is we kind of break it down into what is referred to as like your minor, major, and critical deficiencies. Minor deficiencies are, just your standard type, things that don't really pose a threat at this stage, but it's something that we think it's something that could lead to becoming a bigger problem. So this might be even just documentation, not having your inspections on site or available. Or also maybe there might be some BMPs installed, but they're not quite performing up to the standard of what they should be. So some examples of those are like, you can see the inlet protection device, but needs maintenance. It's also starting to fall into the catch basin. So that's what would be considered something like of a minor deficiency. You can see like your track out area where you have your entrance, ingress, egress, where they have some rocks that are used to stabilize that entrance, but you can see that it needs to be replenished, or maybe because the sediment is starting to accumulate and is starting to compact in that area. So eventually that's going to start leading to track out. Other things are, you can see like the BMP is not installed properly, where there's an overlap, where that silt, that biostock needs to be overlapped, whether there's a gap between it. Or you can see some small spills that are less than 1 square yard or whatever it might be, but it's still contained. However, it just needs the contractor to clean it up, put in absorbents, things like that. Yep. And then you also have your inlet protection device where it's been installed, but you can start seeing some of the holes inside of it starting to appear. So it's starting to degrade. It hasn't come to the point where it's actually failing, but it's still leading to a point where it might become a more major deficiency. So when we talk about major deficiencies, where you're talking about something that's more of a lack of good faith, they're not actually implementing BMPs, they're not following their plans, things like that. And it actually leads to a potential that it actually could be a discharge at that point. So this is something where you can see that there's actually tracking going on, where the BMP itself, people are starting to run over the bile socks. It's not installed properly to the point where it's containing all that sediment runoff, and it's starting to now lead into where it's a discharge into the roadway. You can see here like a concrete washout area where it's pretty much exceeded its capacity and it's starting to overflow. So this would be considered more of a major, where there needs to be maintenance provided, as well as maybe looking at installing a secondary concrete washout area. You can see here another washout area where the polymer is starting to actually seep through. I don't think this, with this, they're putting in filter fabric, but it's not a waterproof seal. So that's why it's starting to leak underneath it. It's actually coming out, as well as starting to overflow. So this is, again, now it's actually led to some type of a discharge. Okay, another one is you can see that they did a good they actually installed silt fences, but now it's already gotten to the point where it's actually degraded. It's not even effective at this point. You can see a slope that's not stabilized, where there's not hydromulch or any type of stabilization on the slope itself. Here's another example where there's multiple violations where there's not actually any sediment control, no perimeter controls. There's actually evidence of the sediment discharging already into the roadway, into the storm drains, and then the catch basin itself that's protected is not installed properly. Here you can see that this is actually could be even considered a critical deficiency where there's no actual BMPs in place at all. They're working on a slope itself. There's no perimeter controls, no stabilization of the slopes itself. They have actual equipment stored on the slope itself. So you can see that this would be already automatically, even though you don't see, maybe they might be sweeping the road, but really in the next rainfall event, all of that is just going to come down. So, which leads to what is referred to as your critical deficiency. So now this is what we're talking about, where it's actually already posed a threat. It's already in the water itself. So we're talking about like when there's no actual erosion controls, it's raining, or it might be even, it might be their irrigation or something, where it's already washing off into the inlets. Another thing is where they're actually working actively in a stream and there's no BMPs again. So this is, of course, something that needs to be fixed immediately. And then, of course, you have your spills where it's actually going into a storm drain at this point where it's actually spilled already. So this is just, what I wanted to do was just share, why we're all talking, what I kind of went through all of this. I know I threw a lot of information at you all at once, but this is just an example of what we used. This is a project that occurred on the windward side. You can see here there was a rainfall event back in 2010. It wasn't a real major event. This was probably less than a 2-year, 24-hour storm event. So probably in that two-inch type of rainfall event. So it's not something that's going to trigger a major flooding. But you can see here that they had a lot of slopes that were unstabilized. They didn't have any kind of diversion. They basically relied on just pretty much what they did was they put together gravel, of course, at the base. They put down some kind of like a sock just to kind of divert the water. And they actually even diverted it directly into the catch basin just to get it so that it wouldn't cause flooding downstream. So this, of course, by doing this, you can see that a lot of the BMPs are not put in place, and there's a lack of good faith effort just to follow the plans. Here's another site. You can see that they're opening up a huge area. This is probably going beyond what the city prescribes in its rules, which is trying to limit the amount of disturbed area to 5 acres at a time. But you can see here, this probably way exceeds 5 acres at a time. It's in a very steep sloped area. They're putting in a subdivision, but they haven't put in a lot of the infrastructure yet. They're just grading, and this is just a mass grading of all this open area and grubbing it. And what you can see here is this is just an example of what happened. And just during that 2000 storm event, it didn't take a lot for it to basically start running through that drain system. And you can see how the effect that it had on the waterway, where it pretty much turned the whole entire lake into basically a chocolate mess. So this is something that, if the contractors, were to at least try to do as best as they can to address, especially the slopes, I think that's one of the critical areas. When you talk about inlet protection, that's pretty much at the downstream end. That's probably the last line of resort. But just putting in things like slope stabilization, diverting water away from your project site, sediment basins, of course, are very effective. Putting in diversions just to kind of break up the area of that drainage area that when we go back to that photo of that whole area, they needed to somehow break it up into smaller chunks and not just rely on, because this project did have a sediment basin all the way at the bottom, but that sediment basin wasn't designed for this amount of runoff. So you could see that it was, in a way, not necessarily designed properly, because in order to address it, they probably need to implement multiple sediment basins and then break it up into smaller chunks if they were going to go about opening up this amount of area. This is just part of the planning process. This is part of the design, as well as for contractors to identify how they can effectively address any of those sources. So that pretty much wraps up my presentation.